this meeting is being recorded. Oh my goodness. That's scary. Do I need to continue? Anyway, right. Well, thank you, Steve, very much for introducing me at such short notice on talking about obtaining a yield. This is not prepared. However, on Trumpet Farm, we do obtain lots of different yields, and the game is to get as much out of everything as possible. Reducing inputs, or at the very least using outputs from one system as an input to another system, and using looking at the land and the operations on the land in the whole holistically, using everything that we've got to the best of its abilities, and also looking for wherever there's opportunities, and that's usually in the margins, which I'm guessing is something that Steve's talked about already and will do again, no doubt. So, as I said the other day, the core functions of the business, or of the project rather, from a project, there are three main core businesses. There's the farm, which is the infrastructure and the animals. There's the food business, and there's the community interest company, being the educational access, horticultural therapy, and growing projects. And growing, whether that's independence of spirit, whether that's growing, nourishing the soul, whether that's growing courgettes, it's all interlinked. But when I first moved to the farm, we didn't have any of that at all. It was literally, my dad used to be a dairy farmer, but wasn't and hadn't been since 1999. I moved back to the farm in 2006 after working abroad for a petrochemical firm. So I was working in China and in Egypt and North Africa, and in the Arab Peninsula as well, working on gas development plants. So we were very much looking at large-scale, industrialized, huge billion-dollar projects, or $3, $4, $5 billion projects, and I was a tiny little spoke in this huge project. But it was really engaging, very interesting, but it was not what I wanted. I knew that it wasn't the way forward for me in that particular industry. But what I did take from it is the level of organisation, and also the way that large organisations move up and down the value chain. So successful organisations in business often, not always, but often, what they do is they start out doing one thing, and they do that very well. If they're a successful business, they do it very well, and they succeed, and they grow, and they make money, and blah, blah, blah. But often what successful businesses do, they don't just stay doing what they do, because competitors will move in, inevitably technology will move forward, money will flow, and that business will be taken over by the next big thing. The way that large and successful businesses can actually mitigate that risk is by moving up and down the value chain. So, for example, we'll take a very small example, a tiny little business, let's say Trumpet Farm. Okay, Trumpet Farm has pigs. Pigs can be made into things. Wonderful. Okay, so they can be made into pies. Let's say start off by saying they may be made into fresh meat. Okay, we started out at Trumpet Farm on farmers markets and the Old Street market on a Wednesday and a Saturday, and other local markets around the place, selling fresh meat. We realised that actually, oh wait, we can add a little bit more value here. We can start making sausages. And after an embarrassingly long period of time, I suddenly realised that actually we can add a little bit more value by cooking the produce. There are many other reasons why we went on to that as well, partly because when you're a small-scale producer, you've got issues to do with continuity of supply. People want fresh produce all the time. When you're a small producer, you have these peaks and troughs of supply. Sometimes you've got far too much, sometimes you don't have enough, and you just don't have that cash flow. I see Kasha laughing. So this is something that we've all got to battle with. But what we found was when we cooked things, then we could batch produce the animals, we can freeze everything down, we can pull it out, pull out the amount of frozen meat that we need on a regular basis each week, cook it off, and we've got a fresh product to be able to sell on a weekly basis. Okay, that was wonderful. But what we found was that we were still buying in ingredients. Well, we're buying in pastry, we were buying in the pork that we couldn't do ourselves. We're buying in the veg. Oh, thank you. Exactly, the leeks and onions and potatoes and blah, 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 broccoli, blah, blah, blah. So we said, okay, well, we need to start adding value, but we also need to be going down the other route. We need to be supplying ourselves as well. So having the food business intrinsically is a customer for the farm, and it's a valued customer who pays on time. we also, so it means it gives purpose to the farm, and that's really the main reason why I have a food business. I didn't wake up one day after living abroad and think, oh, I want to own a bakery. No, I wanted to be a farmer. I woke up one morning and actually did go, I want to be a farmer. But to be able to be a farmer, I needed to obtain a yield from the farm. So with the yield to start off with was the beef cattle that my dad had that he was selling through the farmers market, through the livestock market, sorry. We changed that. I started with pigs, but then I took over the beef herd. We started selling direct to consumer on the farmers markets and things, but then we started adding the pies and selling wholesale. So we're going up the value chain, but also we're going down the value chain because we were also looking what ingredients we were having to buy in, and then using that as an opportunity on the farm, because we can grow things, to try and obtain a yield from other aspects of the farm processes that we were operating. And then also, there's also this thing where if you can take, like I said earlier, if you can take an output from one system and use an input for another, for example, waste veg going into the pigs, the pigs in paddock grazing in the field that turns over the ground and cultivates the ground ready for the next set of plantings to clean the ground, having the chickens following the pigs, and so the chickens are cleaning the ground. They're scrubbing through the pig muck, so lets that break down more quickly. They're also adding their own phosphates and nitrates from the chicken poo. They're also cleaning up any parasites left behind by the cattle or the pigs. So they're reducing costs with regard to the pesticide, the pest load on the cattle, the parasite load.
And just to pause you here, because you're speaking very quickly.
I am. There's a lot to get through.
There's so much. But just that chicken point, because I think about that a lot, is chickens love grubs. They maggots and grubs and larvae. That's their most favourite thing. And that when you have livestock, that becomes an issue. I used to live next to a pig farm, and our house was full of flies. I mean, there's zillions of flies. And so it's also that integrated approach where you're getting another yield, but you're obviously regulating something which really could have been a problem, or it could be a constant
well, it's
thing.
Reducing costs. Okay,
yes.
Let's go to the bottom line. Every time, suck off the sustainability side.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
the environmental.
Let's talk about money. Yeah,
let's talk about the money, the financial sustainability. I can't afford to buy boron. I can't afford to dose the animals.
Yes.
I don't want to, but also I can't afford
it's not economic either.
It's not
it's coming off the bottom line.
So actually, let's look at the processes which both save us money, but then also produce a yield.
Yes.
Byproducts, we get chicken and we get eggs.
Yes.
And we also don't have to spend
pest regulation, which is another really important yield.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, wonderful. Just allow it to give it to chicken in. But
absolutely. No. It's okay.
Good.
Okay. So, I mean, that's essentially it. That's our philosophy. We took a product that we had anyway, which was essentially, it was the pork that I started when I moved back from the farm, back to the farm, and it was the beef cattle that I took over when my dad passed away, and I had to do something with them. And looking at, from my experiences of working in the petrochemical industry, very different industry, but very replicatable work methodologies and design methodologies. They use Six Sigma, which is very similar feedback generated design system, just like permaculture.
Yeah.
It was all about looking at process, making a small change, monitoring and regulate and recording that change and making changes to that system all the time, reducing your costs and looking for any opportunities to replace external inputs with outputs from your existing systems.
Yeah. Brilliant. Okay, there we go.
Cool. Right.
And it is, but also just to, also wind back to the beginning, you said, well, we had pigs and we had cows. Let's go a step further back. You had pasture.
Well, that's funny because sorry to interrupt, but you're quite right. I used to have a conversation with my dad when I was little story. So my dad used to own another 50 acres, but it was separate from the farm. Because he bought Trumpet Farm, he actually inherited from his father. He inherited 50 acres, but it was about 3.5–4 miles away, just down the way in Wood Hill. But he bought Trumpet Farm. When he bought Trumpet Farm, he kept on that 50 acres that he had inherited for many years until I was about 14, 15, 1994, 1995. An opportunity came up to sell the original 50 acres that he had. And he asked me, did I want to be a dairy farmer? Did I want to take over the farm? And so when I was 14, 15, I said, no way, Jose, who wants to be a farmer? Crackers. who wants to do that?
Yeah, right.
So he sold that land, and then it came to the point where, well, now after that, Chocolate Farm was too small to do anything with in a commercial system, a commercial setup. The dairy started to say they started by saying they would go to once a day collection from twice a day, then it went to once every other day, and then they were saying they were going to go once every 3 days. So we would have to invest in infrastructure like storage tanks and chillers and blah blah blah. And it was you could see it was a treadmill. They didn't want us. They were trying to get rid of us. And so Dad retired because I'd already said a few years before that I didn't want to be a farmer. So that was fine. But when I did move back to the farm, there was this big lot of land, 100 acres, 40 hectares. What are we going to do with it? It has no economic activity apart from a few cattle ranging, and there was just not paying Dad's bills, let alone an opportunity for me to do something different. It wasn't paying for the upkeep of the buildings, and so roofs were falling in, and gates were not swinging, and hedges were not being.
To be honest, there's a lot of farms around here that look like that.
Yeah. So moving forward, the first thing was, what are we going to do with this pasture? I mean, we could take it back, and it was discussed as part of the PTC course. We could take it back to woodland, and there was a gentleman on the course, Ian Watts, and he was passionate about moving and just reforesting the entire farm. I took that under consideration, and we looked at it, and actually we identified areas on the farm that would be rewooded, and over the next. We put a woodland management plan in place, so we've got a plan for the next 100 years. We are planting woodlands, but the Chocolate Farm has been a farm for grazing animals for a very long time. But what I wanted to do was to recognise that history, but also move forward in a way that actually appreciated the regenerative capabilities of browsing animals.
Because let's just jump into here a little bit, because this is a very important point to make, is that long-term permanent pasture stacks away a lot of carbon.
Absolutely.
If it's managed correctly.
If it isn't, it can be a horrible,
it can be a nightmare.
Absolutely.
And then when you then manage that strategically on top of that, and agroecology, agroforestry, all of these elements which we haven't quite introduced yet. But these, so in terms of the yields of the farm, it's actually sliding towards, and this is something I was trying to comment on the other day, which is why I wanted to make the point again, is I think carbon sequestration is going to become an overriding objective, a yield, a target for all of our activities in every single way as we can.
And on a very practical level, with regard to farm, so because we've left Europe, the common agricultural policy is no more for farming, which has been the mainstay for the last 40 years of subsidies for farmers, for food producers. That's all out the window. There's been a consultation. They've got a new framework for rewarding farmers for ecological works and for public works for public goods. It's the slogan. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but I have a suspicion it's going to be a lot to do with carbon sequestration.
It's going to have to be. I mean,
and we're going to be quitting.
But it is. It's like actually identifying that that's an important yield. Is actually soil quality. So, and again, I mentioned the other day is 40 billion tons of carbon a year where industry is pumping into the air. The soil can absorb 100 billion tons of carbon a year. If it's managed correctly. And that's an active process, it's not a passive process. And even rewilding is a kind of an active process. You're interacting with the landscape in a sort of strategic way. And again, if you're actively introducing key species, then which ones you're going to bring in and how do you regulate that? And there's a lot of learning to be done. And this is what this conversation, permaculture, agroecology, this is going to become increasingly important. And that sort of overarching view, which is about the long-term maintenance of the ecology of the planet, right? I mean,
and giving us a future, but it's the near-term future where it actually pays the bills, a mid-term future where you're growing a sustainable business for whoever comes next, but then the long-term future where you're actually sequestering that carbon away. So,
and again, just to say, this morning we said in Permaculture 20, what your short-term or immediate yields you might get, shorter-term, medium, and then long-term, and Hans said the words deep time this morning. I kind of quite like that. What are your deep time yields? Let's think really big and beyond your own lifespan even. What is it that we ultimately want to sort of contribute to and be part of? And somehow you've got movement and things happening and progression happening in all of those areas here. So and then another layer of that yield is, of course, here we are sharing the insight and the knowledge of that, and we're still learning as we go through this. It's just, you know,
a work in progress. I always say that Trevor Time is practicing permaculture. We're not very good at it, but we're getting better, a little bit better every day by practicing.
And again, going back to the ethics, I said that in the opening lecture, is that little intersection in the middle where we're doing earth care, people care, fair share every time, hitting the bullseye. I don't know a single darts player in the world that hits a bullseye every time. You know, it's about being consistent and getting things in the zone as best you can. 9 times out of 10, that starts really making a difference.
And also, if you're true to yourself as well, because sometimes you get that dart completely outside the
miss the board and everything.
Completely, you hit the wall and put a dent in the wall. But sometimes there are contributing factors that are just completely outside of your control, and you have to do things which go against you completely. But if you can, against the short-term goal, it's sometimes the short and medium and the long-term goals can be in conflict. That doesn't mean that you can't move towards your end goal.
Absolutely, and we shouldn't be beating each other up or ourselves up for not hitting a bullseye every time, because we can't, and we're learning. So my definition of permaculture, really, from the first lecture, from the ethics lecture, is it's a commitment to that journey. I'm going to now start consciously trying to hit that bullseye, even if I'm miles off or I'm coming in from, you know, randomness. We can only get better by doing it. There's only one way to, you know, you've got to sort of keep trying and learning the lessons and observing and interacting, no less. Yeah.
Nice one.
So, yield. Thank you, Ian.
No problem.
Wonderful.
Cheers, guys.
Great. And I've got special yield in the form of a chili bean with fresh coriander, I have to say. I only mentioned fresh coriander today, earlier today.
Hello.
And there it was. It's obviously a fresh coriander kind of day. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ian, in fact. I'm going to go back to sharing screen. Hang on. Share screen. Okay, so just a few thoughts through the eyes of my good friend Chris Dixon. I've actually not seen him in a little while. I know he's been having some health problems. I think he has MS. I noticed he'd been active on Facebook recently, so I'm hoping he's okay. Chris moved to Wales. I moved to Wales, I think, 94, and I think Chris Dixon had moved to Wales in 84, so he's further down the line than me. Of all the migrants to Wales that I know, Chris is the only one who speaks Welsh better than his neighbours. And when you live in Dolgellau, that is some achievement. So he's now even attending sort of Welsh cultural events, and he's a bit embarrassed to be pushed in that, but to some extent he speaks, you know, there's a lot of Welsh speakers who don't like speaking Welsh to non-Welsh speakers because their Welsh isn't very good, because they weren't taught it, you know, anyway, an aside. And if I have time, I'll try and dig out some of his other observations about landscape, and he's put some of the traditional Welsh farming practices into a permaculture context, which is also very interesting to think about. These are more general observations that Chris has made, and there were some ideas that Chris put into my mind a few years ago that I'm still now working on. Paul, was that a question from you, Paul? No, I can see your hand up. Oh, you just say hi. Okay. There's also a little message box if you want to share a message. Anyway, here we go. Oops. Okay, how does this work? Oops. Okay. We heard Sepp Holzer this morning get quite a bit intense, actually, about the horrors that have visited upon the Austrian landscape by monocultural tree plantation. And unfortunately, in Wales, we have very much a similar experience of very big, far-reaching decisions made by people seemingly who know nothing about ecology. How do these decisions get made, Ian? Anyway, so this is what Chris would call an upside-down landscape. We're talking about needing to be the upper slopes to be forested, the lower slopes are forested. I think this is part of Coed de Brennan. And this is a monoculture of, I think, probably Western hemlock. This is like, again, the Welsh naturalist Iolo Williams would say, this is like a graveyard. Every one of these trees is a tombstone. They throw a very deep shade. They acidify the soils. They're very, very deep roots, so it can cause a lot of flooding and runoff problems, very shallow roots rather. And they're not part of the ecology here. So when you go into these places, you don't hear any birds. It's dark. It kind of feels a bit creepy, actually. It doesn't feel nice. They're certainly not teeming with happy bunny rabbits and deers and what have you. And this is again, it's a kind of colonialism. It's this kind of imposition from the outside of just seeing nature as a resource base, you know? So this is not obtaining a yield in my mind. This is trying to obtain a kind of a monocultural yield at the expense of the landscape and expense of the culture that surrounds it as well, because that's carpeted over lots and lots of traditional landscape management practices, which are now being forgotten and replaced by these really horrible industrial processes. And this is a global phenomenon. We're seeing it everywhere. Somehow we need to be much more involved in the planning and decision-making, actioning of these kind of resource decision-making sort of things, and actually change the Welsh Environment Agency to the National Resources Wales, which the NRA, that sounds like, oh, NRW, sorry, that's the National Rifle Association. Okay, but similar, you know, we're at war with our landscape, sadly. Anyway, so, and also this is what they do. Once you then had your monoculture forest and you completely shaded out and acidified the ground, and then what they do is they come along and they chop the whole lot down in one go and clear fell it. Look at the bleaching. You can just see all those tree trunks kind of bleached in the sunlight. Imagine the stress that's putting on the soil, and whatever soil there was there, and whatever soil organisms there was there. Think about how much that is being sort of distressed by that clear felling sort of strategy. And then it's a little bit hard to discern this photo, but I mentioned this the other day about these machines that do the clear felling. They have big, huge caterpillar tracks, and they drive straight up the slope. Obviously, it's too steep to go sideways. So then they create gully erosion that literally stripes up and down the mountain. It's just ready to channel that water off and to facilitate, you know, rapid erosion. The white there is a dog that's just turning around in the track of the this is obviously where the track of the digger, and you can see there's already water flowing, and it's already a little gully erosion strip happening. So this is resource extraction without any consideration that it's having on the landscape or it's having on the community that surrounds it. So when we say obtain a yield, I just want to make it very clear that we don't mean like this. We don't mean by at the price of the landscape, at the price of the ecology, and at the price of the community and the society that surrounds it. How can we obtain yields in a way that is absolutely harmonizes with our earth care, people care, fair share ethic? How can we do that? And obviously, it's moving in partnership with nature is the answer, and this is sort of what we're trying to values we're trying to infuse here. Now, this next couple of slides, Chris loves telling this story, and I'm going to try and tell it, bring his words to life. Mid Wales is the sort of coastal side of Mid Wales. So Chris lives on the back side of this is Cadair Idris. Cadair is chair. Idris was a legendary giant. So it was Idris's chair is a spectacular mountain with this Coombe Lake at the top. I think I already showed you a picture of Tinkai. Thank you. And it's this, I don't know, I guess it was some igneous extrusion of some very hard rocks, probably from some previous geological activity a long time ago. It's very, very hard. And let's just think about this for a moment. Here's a big lump of exposed rocks being shoved up with the earth mantle, shoved up into the atmosphere. That's being weathered constantly. Think of the Welsh climate, the driving rain, the frost, the sun. Think about how that water is going to permeate every little crack all those mosses and lichens weathering the rocks, water seeping in, expanding and contracting with the changing of the temperature, slowly crumbling that rock away. And somehow you can see all these scree slopes, see all this loose boulders and rocks. And that's the beginning of soil formation. Obviously, this is like, when we talk about, I talked earlier about when the capture store energy, I talked about how there's resources flowing past you all the time, flowing downhill, whether it's water or fertility or knowledge or whatever. And in some very real way, you can realize is this is soil formation, soils migrating downhill, the rocks slowly breaking, and eventually starting to, you know, feed the fields that form below. Now you can see the early succession that's coming and taking advantage of these new habitats and areas. All of that's a bit of an aside to get to the point that Chris was trying to make. And it was an interesting thing. He always put this in a negative way. And I think that it's revealing in its own way, though. So in permaculture, we're interested in trying to find leverage points. How can we find a place where we make the smallest input, smallest investment of time of energy, but it creates the biggest output? So in terms of creating yields, we don't want to just be laboriously working away. We want to be able to sort of be strategic, make it smallest possible input for the biggest possible output. Well, back these photos are from back in the 80s when Chris first came to the area. In the 80s, there was very high unemployment, and the then Conservative government initiated all of these employment creation programs, community project, manpower services, things like that. And what it did was you just got your dole money plus a tenner, and you had to go and do a certain number of hours per week, and it took you off the dole figures, but and they kind of created kind of nothing jobs for people to do. And one of the nothing jobs that they created was to repair all the footpaths on Cadair Idris, important part, touristic part of Wales, and lots of people going up there. And actually there's a high footfall up on these hills, and they really do carve a notch in the landscape, all those people wandering along there. And somewhere at the top of this very, very, very steep slope. Now remember again, as we talked about how up on these thin skeletal soils on the top of impermeable rocks, you get peat bogs. And you get an accumulation of organic matter, and you get wet, squidgy bits. And sometimes then, if you get a little bit of an issue of water, it comes into a wetland, then you get a sort of a real muddy patch, and it can be quite messy. So the whoever it was, the path repair department, had the genius idea of somewhere up here on the top of this slope, we'll excavate through this peat bog and we'll put a pipe, only so in diameter, but we'll have a little pipe there, so that when excess water comes, instead of making it muddy on the footpath, it flows through the pipe and exits down the side of the slope. Then we had a rain event. We had some very heavy rain. That little pipe then became a jet of like a high-powered fireman's hose of water squirting out, where normally it would have been oozing and trickling its way through the landscape, right? That's what happens in nature. You put it into a pipe, and suddenly you concentrate it all, like I was just saying about gully erosion, that explosive, erosive force of water plus gravity. Okay, so try and hold this picture in your mind as I scroll to the next slide. Just keep that view. This was the one day, this was the next day. And what you can now see is half the mountains come down. There's a huge landslide. That's just caused by one wrong intervention. And in fact, Sepp Holzer said in his video, he said, when you're high up in a mountain, if you get it wrong, you get it really wrong. So I'm holding some of these thoughts in my mind as we're playing around with this school ground in Rwanda, but at least we're not on top of a mountain, and hopefully we're not going to create that effect, but we're definitely not. But this is what really, it's a little introduction to the dangers of doing things wrong, trying to move water downhill all the time, and understand that in nature there's other forces at work that are kind of and we're going to explore that a little bit through these next slides anyway. So all of this is really quite important. So here's our upside down landscape. Here's our massive erosion from a very small intervention. Here's some thoughts about clear felling of forests and thinking about how that interfaces with erosion and rapid depletion of really large scale environments. So erosion up in the hills equates to mud down in the villages, mud blocking up the drains. This is soil. This is the most important thing, remember, the thing on which we all depend for our long-term survival. And we seem very happy. You think about the scale at which this is constantly happening. With all of these biomass crops that we're seeing around being grown now in Wales, there's a lot of, I mean, my Kenyan friends would be appalled to hear they're growing maize, not as a food, not as a fodder for animals, but as to be minced up and fed into biomass reactors to be fermented to create electricity. And these biocrops aren't a very efficient way because they're being farmed by using diesel and nitrates, which are nitrate fertilizer, people, is made out of natural gas. You have to understand that. It's just pure energy. If you think back of the bad old days of the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, what did they make their bombs out of? You remember? Fertilizer. Yeah, it's energy in a pure form. That's all it is. And that's what we're chucking on the soils to grow crops, which we're then trying to convert back into energy again. This is nuts. Anyway, I digress. These are not yields. And sorry, someone speaking? I didn't hear that. Sorry, I didn't hear you. Anyway, I'll carry on. So, and then the soil, the loss of soil continues. This is a global thing. You don't need to go to Dolgethai to see it. But obviously this is distressing for Chris to see it going on around. It's distressing for all of us. So when to grow maize as a biomass crop, they leave it in the field till nearly November. And they harvest it, and the fields are empty November, December, January, February, just completely empty, bare soil, which is the time when we get all the rain. And some of the roads around us are like that deep in mud because it's all been washing out of the fields. So there's not joined up thinking going on, and I don't really understand how it is that we're, on the one hand, talking about climate change and conservation, and on the other side, doing things that are really totally insane like this. So, and then ironically, what happens is, this is the Malvach estuary, this is the river that comes out from Dolgethai, and they're actually trying to now drain and farm down in the riverbed because that's where the soil's all ended up. So it's sort of chasing the problem further and further downstream, unfortunately. So we see these things around us, we get exasperated. It inspires us to work harder in the other direction.
So, but remember, connected on the medical part, it is about livelihood and protecting our frontline workers. Right now, that's what we want to concentrate on.
You were speaking.
No, that sounds like a radio or something.
Can everybody check to see if they've got their mics open?
What? That's okay, don't worry. Okay, I think we're okay. Okay, anyway, so these are our kind of opening thoughts. Again, in managing, bad management in the uplands creates rivers choked with all the stuff that was supposed to be back up in the uplands. Let's think, I want to talk a bit about water and streams, upland drainage systems and things like that, and also try and kindle together a little bit of the magic about water. And this is the bit where I'm going to try and inspire you to go into our video section and find the video on Victor Schauberger. Now, he wrote a book in 40s or 50s called Living Water. And to read it is fantastical, but also is, you end up feeling like this is all a bit too out there. This is sounds a bit no one had ever really managed to be able to recreate the things that Victor Schauberger had observed and worked on. So he was a forest ranger in, let's say, the 30s, in the sort of Austrian, Bavaria sort of part of South Germany, Austria, just before the war. So again, a lot of his work got a bit lost and mystified by the obviously the upsets and everything created by the Second World War. As a naturalist and as someone who worked in national parks, he was a great observer of nature. So this is why we know it's interesting to go and look. Even though some of the things that he wrote about and talk about are a little bit esoteric and a little bit out there, he was a genuine observer of nature. And he was only trying to recreate and understand the forces of what he was observing. So a very simple observation of Victor Schauberger's is this, is that if you look down into a clear mountain stream, maybe with a certain amount of flow in it, you can see the trout, the freshwater fish that like to live in that environment. The trout obviously beautifully shaped, think about how streamlined their bodies are. And his first observation was the trout sit in quite fast-flowing waters with their noses pointing upstream, and they looks like they're not moving. So why aren't they being washed backwards? This was a simple question that he asked. Why aren't the trout being washed backwards? And then he started to imagine how the forces might shape around them. So if the water breaks around their noses, it creates a vortex around their body. If you run your fingers on the skin of a trout against the grain, this way they're very smooth, they're going up against the grain, it's like sandpaper. It's very, very tough. And he imagined that the water is breaking around their nose and then it's creating a vortex that's actually then flows back against itself. You imagine that shape. And that somehow is the trout is actually physically holding the water with its body. And that might sound slightly fantastical, but if you observe it, they're not moving, they're not doing exerting any energy, not doing any work, and they're not being washed backwards. So somehow they are gripping and holding the water. He started to think about what is the shape of water. And as water tumbles down a stream, imagine there's our picture now, look at our slide, there's our water flowing down a stream. It's not flowing in a straight line, is it? Because there's turbulence. You've got, the world is spinning, so that's going to add some kind of movement to the water. It's not going to just flow down. I just keep saying, to the point of being boring, water flows downhill, which it does. But try pouring water on a pane of glass and watch how it moves. It doesn't go straight down. It wobbles. That's because there's friction, there's dirt on the grass, there's grease, there's reasons. So, and then add to that the spin of the earth and the fact that the water has its own kind of qualities and shape, depending on the processes it's been through prior to that. So let's go back to our mountain stream. What Schauberger observed was the water corkscrews down the stream. It has a shape. It does this as it moves down. And obviously it's bouncing off the rocks and it's doing various things, but and that creates a corkscrew vortex that keeps the water in the channel. The water's sort of creates its own shape and dynamism. So he started to talk about characteristics of water being young, medium, and old. The difference between rainwater and water from a spring or from a well. They actually have intrinsically different characteristics. Now, even when we were talking about the cloud formation and rain yesterday, or was it the day before, I talked about how when water re-evaporates off the leaves of trees, it's actually picking up some of the bacteriophage and DNA and random little bits of biological information that might just be covering the surface of every leaf potentially. So you can think about how, again, that informs and changes the nature of the water. So all these are kind of interesting thoughts. So the next thing that Schauberger noticed was that when you look over the bridge and you look seeing those fish static in the water, if you make them jump, if you shock them, and they don't to escape, they flick their tail and they shoot upstream against the flow of the water. And he was thinking again why don't they go downstream? Why wouldn't they take the energy of the water to accelerate their escape in the other direction? Where somehow they seem to be able to convert the energy of the water going one way into a thrust going in the other way. So then he started to think about, could you bring this into engineering? Could you explore this kind of phenomenon by, into engineered environments? And he started to think about ways that you could work and intervene with rivers and waterways and flows of water in a way in which you can keep the water in the channel. So there's places. So then he got hired by a company that was deforesting the very forest that he loved. Ironically, I guess he didn't think that far ahead, but when they wanted to build log flumes, like these kind of concrete or brick channels with water flowing in them, that you could send the logs that you'd forested down. Obviously, they didn't have big trucks, there weren't roads, they were trying to log very remote areas in the Tyrol or wherever. And they would float the logs. And to get the log from one valley to a next or into a river system, they'd literally construct these flumes. So Schauberger then started taking some of the insights and knowledge that he gained as a forester and putting that into constructing ways to make water to do work to carry materials for construction and what have you, for logging, obtaining yields, I guess. Now, he came up with some pretty wacky ideas. I'm not the person who's going to explain what they were and how they work, because this gets a little bit out there for me, but I'm queuing up the video because I read the book. I thought it was years ago, 20 years ago, I read the book, and it did really interest me. And I'm kind of still trying to remember some of my insights from that now. But as the time passed on, it's all started to sound more and more fantastical to me. And I'm quite a rooted in reality kind of guy, so I don't go to too much esoteric stuff. But then I realized that his children or grandchildren had set up the Schauberger Institute in, I think, in Graz or somewhere in Austria, where they've now started to test all of his ideas using modern probes and sensors and what have you. And I'm telling you, you need to watch this video. It's very, very interesting.
Is this on your show?
No, I'm not, because it's a bit long and it's a bit technical, and I'm kind of just want to really more inspire people to look into it. I'm just going to chat a bit more about this stuff. So I'm going to just step back a bit from Schauberger, you know, because there's other people who've been talking about water having memory and structure and shape, and actually there's more and more of a kind of an growing scientific interest in this, not just about, you know, whatever. Anyway, I'm going back to this. So now, who's come across and experienced a flow form? Such a thing called a flow form. It's a shape. It comes from Schauberger's research. It's a shape, and it looks like a figure of 8, and it's sort of carved into or cast into a piece of stone or, you know, ceramic. Meant a piece of ceramic. It kind of has 2 chambers. There's a left and right ventricle to it, and a flow, and there's a lip in the middle. So what you can do is you can arrange several of these flow forms in a line, and there's a straight flow down it. So you can imagine that what would happen is the water will just flow straight down it, and it doesn't. But what it does is it comes down and then it slooshes around the right-hand ventricle, and then it goes around the left-hand ventricle and down the spout, and then it does it again left and right. And you can connect a series of these things, a series of these together, and the water will just naturally, without any energy put into it, it will alternate between the 2 ventricles as it flows down, going in this figure of 8. It naturally wants to take a long, complex, structured, shaped path rather than going straight down through the system. So as much as I've been telling you all for days now how water always flows downhill, is it does, but it doesn't always do it in a straight line. It has an interesting kind of dynamic shape and journey to it. So explore flow forms, Schauberger. Just a little bit, invite a little bit of kind of nature's own magic and allow yourself to understand that we can't quite understand the complexity of the natural world, even now. And compare that to the sort of brutish monoculture ideas that we're imposing on it, we realize that we're really missing some of the beauty and magic and complexity of the natural world. Okay, so here's our lovely mountain stream. Look how it's slushing down. Imagine, you can see that there's this sort of flow form thing happening. It's corkscrewing its way down here. It's staying in its channel. And what's interesting is you'd think that a mountain stream would be running much faster than the middle, or let's say the sort of estuarine part of a river. And it's actually not true, because if if you put something like a ping pong ball or I don't know, a rubber duck or something into that water, it'll whoosh down there like it's on a slide, and then it'll get caught in the thing. It'll bobble around here for a few minutes, and it'll whoosh over to here, and there's all sorts of turbulence and eddies within the water. So again, these are things that Schauberger understood into engineering, how to make things flow easily without them all jamming up. And he also made really big logs float in very shallow water. We're not talking huge, complex things. It's clever. When you see the video, you start going, "Oh, hang on a minute, this is nuts." It's, you know, anyway. I think I've said enough about it. Anyway, so this is this all this fascinates me. So water flows downhill. It does it, but it doesn't do it in a straight line, and it swooshes around and it corkscrews. So then the next thing that Chris noticed is this: is that they then had another very heavy rainfall, and this happened. The river, the stream, the mountain stream dammed itself. A self-damming stream. And what you can see, obviously, there's been a whole torrent of water's come down there. It's picked up any dead branches, any random detritus that's lying there. And they've got, something's got jammed across, look by those two trees there, it's got jammed across. Other things have built up behind it. Gravels and stones and cobbles and pebbles have then got caught behind it. And the stream has dammed itself. So what you have to realize is, that's a natural process. That would be happening actually regularly whenever we have some kind of, you know, big rain event. And obviously, what would happen now is you send your people on your manpower services job creation scheme, and you give them some chainsaws and some shovels, whatever, and you go up to the river and you go, well, that's not very tidy, is it? We need to, you know, tidy it up a bit. And what you do is you'd unblock the stream, because that you'd see that as a messy kind of thing. But just pause, put your Schauberger hat on, right? Let's just impartially observe and ask ourselves some questions here. So let's leave this alone. Let's not interfere. Let's ask ourselves what's going to happen if we just let nature take its course. This is natural design doing its thing. Well, the more that river, the water's coming down, it's going to hit that barrier. It's not going to stop it, is it? The water's going to flow away, find a way round, a way through. It's going to well up behind it and trickle over the top. But any one of those things that it does, it's going to slow it down. And when water that's carrying sediments, carrying bits, whether they're leaves or bits of stick, or even some of that soil off the mountaintop that those nasty foresters have been eroding into, it's going to deposit behind there, isn't it? And that dam, if it doesn't wash away in the next big surge of flooding, which is also possible, but that dam could very easily then start to build up behind with gravels and silts and soils. It's going to turn into a wetland. You're going to get a bog, and the river's going to become much, much broader, and it's going to seep its way around and slowly find its way back into the channel again. So you're going to stop the erosion. You're going to stop the transport of materials. So suddenly the Malbec estuary isn't going to be filling full of silt like we were seeing in that earlier picture. In fact, the rivers start to self-regulate. But that's kind of interesting, isn't it? Then we started to think, there used to be a mammal that lived in this country. They did exactly that. You know, we forget, and I've said this before, but I'll just expand on this again, is we've forgotten. Our landscape used to have elephants in it. It was 100,000 years ago, but there used to be elephants. And only a few hundred years ago, there were beavers everywhere. And what beavers do is they dam streams. They dam streams to make a pond. They make the river deeper. A deeper river creates habitat for other creatures. It's like getting otters, you get fish, you get, you've got stiller, deeper water. It has much more opportunities for things. You get more insects hatching, which brings in more birds, which then cycles more phosphate, which then actually helps other diversity of plants come in. Beavers are what they call keystone species. They are habitat creators. So remember when we looked at the trophic pyramid, and I said sometimes you get these higher beings high up on the trophic scale, fourth, fifth level, and they actually become energizers for the whole ecosystem. So once the system's built to the point that it can sustain beavers, the beavers then extend the system and they bring in all sorts of other species too. So this then comes into ages us into the idea of rewilding. What are these? If we can understand natural forces, natural processes better, how can we have that minimum input to create a maximum output? If one little pipe can bring down half of Cadaridris, what can we do with a few sticks and stones in a river? Well, let's just start to think about how we could use the same things to reverse processes rather than just see everything as you know, in the negative. So self-damming rivers ultimately create wetlands and marshes. So beavers, in there, when they build their little dams, they slowly silt up and they slowly create bits of wetland. So then they go on to make another one. So they're constantly working. They're really hard-working things, beavers. Now, there have been some selective reintroduction of beavers in certain parts of Wales, in Devon, and in Scotland. And they instantly start transforming the landscape. There's lots of ways that having beavers everywhere would be a bit annoying, and they'd make, in the lowlands, it'd make things a bit muddy and boggy. But we need to learn, we need to understand, firstly, the forces, the energies. They're there for a reason in the landscape. They're not just, you know, saying, obviously, it's because they're habitat creators, they're ecosystems engineers, we're missing them. And we need to firstly understand the processes that they're fulfilling, and then secondly, maybe learn how to revalue them and reincorporate them. You know, what were they called? The Canadian, the colonial company that had the Northern Canadian Shield, a British company, I thought they were called. They had the rights to the drainage basin of the Hudson Valley, the Hudson River, Hudson Bay rather, which turned out to be about 2/3 of Canada. It's absolutely enormous area. And they extracted just about every single beaver from that. They created vast amounts of wealth. Anyone who's seen the movie The Revenant knows what that's all about. Those pelts, you know what they killed all those beavers for? Top hats. There's Victorian kind of stovepipe hats things they used to wear. They're all made out of beavers. This is probably pretty warm, pretty waterproof. But anyway, I'm feeling sorry for the beavers right now. Anyway, feeling it.
The beaver thought they were pretty warm.
They did, yeah. Poor things. Anyway, so we've misunderstood all sorts of things about natural processes because we like things to be tidy and ordered. And we see water should go downhill. We don't want nasty wetlands and bogs and things because they're muddy and mucky and all of that. I don't even know why we think that, but we do. So, rivers are self-damming. Interesting. Okay. Chris, like Victor Schauberger, is a great observer of nature. And he says, he talks a lot about observation of your land, observation. He said when he first bought his bit of land, he dreamt of having a bit of land for years and moving up to Wales. It's like they got 7 acres in Coed y Brenin. It was a sheep grazed, a sheep desert surrounded by long-term, actually quite well-planted plantations. So part of Coed y Brenin was planted 70, 80 years ago and quite thoughtfully, some of it. Anyway, so he started to study the natural regeneration on his land. He decided one part of his land was going to leave it alone, zone 5, no intervention, only observation. He would go down there every day. And he said at the beginning, he would get down on his hands and knees and look part between the grass and look to see what he could see. And he had no idea even what he was looking for. And he thought about planting trees. He wanted to rewild this area and regenerate this area, but he didn't know what to put. And he thought, I'm going to listen to the land. I'm going to observe it with as much. I'm going to make notes about the weather, whether I spot a blackbird or a thrush or a kite or whatever, write all down in his notebook. And one of the things that he noticed was that even before he, even within weeks or a month or two of been there, one thing they'd done was excluded grazing animals because they wanted to study regeneration. And what he realized was that even within a few weeks, hundreds of trees started coming up. And some of them, he looked at oaks and they'd been nibbled so many times, had like 10 or 20 leaders, but the tree was only like about 2 inches tall because they'd just been nibbled so many times by the sheep. And he very quickly realized he wasn't going to need to plant any trees at all. and that the land was already completely full of seeds and seedling. The seedbed there was ready to go. And so then instead he just started observing and taking notes about what came up and how one plant interacted with another. He went down a whole big observation around gorse. Again, most people don't have much positive to say about gorse because it's spiky and stuff like that. What he very quickly realized was that the gorse was the nursemaid plant for the tree, the regeneration of the trees. It was a key species in rebuilding the landscape. Where you've got degraded soils, you're going to tend to get nitrogen fixing volunteer plants arriving. So they're actually indicators of low fertility. But the thing that gorse can do is it can provide its own fertility. So it starts manufacturing a habitat. It's another habitat builder, another keystone species in the plant world, as it can start to regenerate the landscape. At that time, Coy de Brennan, there were a lot of deer. And again, a big limiting factor about whether the regenerating species, trees would actually get to maturity or not was whether they got eaten by the deer or not. What was really obvious to Chris quite early on was anything that was germinating within a gorse bush didn't tend to get grazed by the deer. Animals, the very tip, next time you're out, you see gorse, look at it, especially in the spring, it's very spiky, but there's a soft tip of the fresh growth, and it's not spiky at all, it's soft. And you can tell when the sheep or horses have been grazing on the gorse because they've got little blood, sort of, little spiky things on their lips. But they love it. And the gorse is kind of prepared to give up that little shoot on its tip because the rest of the plant is protected by these older spines and hardened. So what happens when you keep pinching out the apical bud on a plant is the plant gets denser and denser, doesn't it? You get more and more spikes. So the more a gorse bush is grazed by things like deer or sheep, whatever, is the tighter and denser it becomes, and therefore the more impenetrable it becomes. There's also a kind of self-regulating thing going on there, which is kind of interesting. And then birds shelter in there, wind blows in things, so you get seeds and detritus and things building up inside the gorse bush. And Chris was like observing gorse. What he notices is that the gorse, if it's not being grazed, it will start to rise up and it'll get quite leggy. And after 8, 9, 10 years, it's got these long, kind of quite leggy branches, and then they just fall over because they come too tall. And suddenly all that light goes into the center of the bush, bang, up come 20 ash trees, sycamores, or whatever that was in there. So he said, started to understand the succession, understand how one plant then enabled the next one. So let's also think about abstracting that. Think about how, in anything that we're trying to do in terms of developing an enterprise, developing yields, what's the keystone species? What are the processes? What's the nursemaid activity? Sorry. I swallowed a bit of gorse earlier. I was trying to eat it in there. So we're trying to think about the enablers, if you like, the things that can help accelerate change and build systems. So all of this stuff was what Chris was thinking once he's down on his hands and knees, looking between the grasses. It's a fascinating guy. He's got a website. I'm trying to think what it is. It's got something very odd name. Something like consk.org. So I have to look it up for you. Anyway, I move on. Let's go back to the picture. What we see there is Chris's drive where he parks his car. And if you observe that, firstly, you can see that's a hose pipe. And it's raining. You can see that it's raining because there are little rain splashes in the puddle there. And the puddle has formed is uphill, of the hose pipe. The hose pipe is not sealed to the ground. It is not a dam. And yet water is flowing downhill and it's being held back. And that's because the water's arriving ever so faster than it's leaving. That made Chris think a few things. One was, that's not a sealed surface, that's just compacted ground, yet it's enough to contain water. It's to hold water. The hose pipe isn't solid fixed to the ground, but it's still enough to hold water. And again, perhaps water seeping under it, it's left behind little bits of silt or whatever, which is kind of like self-sealing. So he realized in some ways he was saying a similar thing to that. but in obviously a casual way, left a hose pipe across the drive. As an observer, Chris would say this: you need to see your land, your community, whatever it is that you're observing, the thing you want to understand, you want to see it at its extremes. See it on a nice sunny day in the middle of June, larks singing in the sky. Oh, this is beautiful, it's paradise. You got to see it in the depths of winter when you haven't seen the sun for weeks and it's cold and there's frost on the ground. And to begin to understand a piece of land or whatever, an environment or a reality, whatever it is what we're observing, we need to see it at its extremes. What's it like when it's been raining for 3 weeks and then you get a downpour, when the ground's already saturated? That's going to tell you a lot. That's when you start to see where the cracks are, where the vulnerabilities are, or possibly where a fantastic opportunity might lay. What's it like when it hasn't rained for months and then you get a rainfall? Or what's it like? Another interesting thing is, you know, when you've had a really cold night and you've got hoarfrost, like standing crystals of ice standing on everything, and then you get a clear, bright day and the sun comes out, and you see the hoarfrost melt. And there's some parts of your land where it's melted by whatever, 8, 9, 10 o'clock in the morning. And there's other parts where by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it's still there and it's still cold. And that's somehow giving you a map of how your land is receiving sunlight. Makes you understand more about microclimate, and then understand how the diversity that might be within your land in a very subtle way. But all of these things are quite revealing, just through active observation. So you'll notice that it's raining and Chris is out observing his land. That's because he really feels that's an important part of time to do it. And I've got to say, we were building swales and things around some schools in Uganda a few years ago, and I woke up early one morning, it was just the first light, chucking it down the rain, and I thought, remember Chris Dixon, I said, and I pushed myself out the door, and I went and looked, and it was fascinating because the swales were full, and I could see where they were, you know, they needed adjustment and what have you, where it wasn't quite level, or where there was, you know, it was being damaged because people were walking on it. All of these things start to reveal themselves to you. So that's another really important consideration, I would say. Okay, so it's very water flowing downhill. It's very easy to interrupt the flow of water downhill, even with a barrier that isn't even impermeable. So then, this was a strategy then that led Chris to build his first. Firstly, he called it a swale. Then he went and did lots of reading and research, and he's a kind of a reading and research kind of guy. And he came back with the idea that it's not really a swale. He decided it's a foss dovery, a watering ditch. He chose the Welsh word, and he understood that the Welsh know a lot about water. You might be surprised to hear. We're a high rainfall landscape. Actually, Welsh engineering is incredible, because the other thing, apart from farming and forestry, that's gone on a lot in Wales is mining and quarrying. And mining and quarrying, a lot of it happened, most of it stopped in the 30s. There was a lot of quarrying around Wales up until after the Second World War, when it wasn't really the labour force anymore, and we also had machines, you know, more machines to do it. But it was all done with water power, with hydropower, and mechanical force of water. And all those years I spent working at CAT, which was a massive old slate quarry, and you understand most of that had been done not with machine tools and everything, but with levers and water power. And one of the things that you learn about when working with water, I've already touched on this, is about the closer you can keep it to level, the more you can manage it, and you can use that power very, very carefully. And so what Chris wanted to do here is that this lower part of his land here is very, very wet already, and he wanted to grow vegetables all year round without having mains water, without having a tap. This is what Emma Maxwell was telling us about this morning. He needed a constant supply of moisture to feed his garden. His garden's like below the front part of the picture. So this swale, not swale, and it's not a swale because it's not level, it's not on contour, but it's 1 in 200 fall. So in 200 meters, it drops 1 meter. And that's enough to make sure, because water always goes downhill, remember, I think I told you that, the water's always going to come this way and heading towards this garden. Even in a very heavy rain event, it's going to go very, very slowly. And it's just going to trickle towards. It's sending it very gently in the direction that he wants to use it. So subtlety. Now, he did this intervention a long time ago. And having established it, he then thought he could use it then to create like a corridor, a green corridor across the land, a living fence, hedge, something like that. And that was what they went for. Now, remember, form follows function. He was designing his land to do particular things. Chris was very interested in regeneration. Him and his partner wanted to feed themselves. But her particular line of employment, her speciality, is that she's a horse behavioral therapist. She's a horse whisperer. Monty Roberts is her guru, if you know about that world. So and again, it's about working with the behavior of the animal, understanding its instincts, and behaving, working with the animal in a very empathetic way. And anyway, that's what she did. So part of what their landscape needed to do was to be a very good horse environment. It's a good place for horses to, you know, whatever, that's part of their design. Anyway, so that is the same view some years later. And what we're seeing now is along that line where that swale, not swale was, is now they've planted an edible forage hedge that subdivides the land, creates a green corridor, creates a wildlife corridor, feeds birds, feeds insects, feeds bats, provides habitat, multiple functions, but also subdivides the land and provides sticks and poles. Chris is very interested in sticks and poles, and so am I, with something which we're both very interested in, and fodder for the horses. So next picture is this. This is a carefully thought through, designed situation. This is years down the line. There's Lynn doing her horse behavioural therapist, working with horses. So just to say very quickly is, first thing we notice is the horse is standing on a mat. And that's because they're very aware of the impact of compaction, of what we call poaching, where animals are tramping on the ground. If they're tramping in the same place, you get real compaction. So that's an issue. So again, it's just sort of thoughtful design. Secondly is, you notice they've gone down then that green hedgeway, that living corridor, and they've felled out the taller poles of sticks. It's harvesting, it's a yield. The horses love it. Horses are grazer browsers. That means that they eat a lot of grass, but they love to chew on the hedges. So eating ash here. Ash is very nutritious. And not only the horses, keeps them busy, it keeps them happy, it's good for their teeth and all that sort of stuff. So there's a yield for the horse, chomping away, eating all of that, those lovely ash leaves, getting nutrients, micronutrients, different kinds of things that we're not going to get from the grass. Then the horse will happily peel all the bark off with its teeth, chew it all off, and again, you know, it's probably good for the horse and what have you. And you end up then with a pile of sticks. Chris thought, I've created a yield, another yield from my system. Now, back in the early days, we've talked quite a lot about wood chip today. Wood chip is a rather wonderful resource. In the early days of producing sticks, Chris clubbed together with a few neighbours, made a little cooperative, and they bought a chipper between them. And they'd take it in turns to chip all this kind of brash. Because again, if you're doing this kind of farming, allowing all the hedges just to grow out and doing forest gardening and all of this, you end up with lots of sticks and with lots of what we call brash a lot of the time. And you've got to learn to value it. Actually, it's very important stuff. Narrow diameter wood dries out very quickly. And in ye olde days, the common fuel to use, like in the Middle Ages, whatever, was what they called faggots. And a faggot was something like what you're seeing in the picture, a bundle of sticks, but it had been cut so it's like 12 inches long. And you'd have a tight bundle of sticks that would be very dry. And they were for cooking. And often you'd have a faggot oven, a domed brick oven, and you toss a few of those in there. They burn very hot and fast because they're dry, narrow diameter wood, creates a very hot, short-lived, hot fire, which is what you want for certain kinds of cooking and for burning monks at the stake. That was the other thing they used to use them for. You see in the old history books. We don't do that anymore, by the way. Even in Wales, we've stopped doing that. But, so, Chris had a big pile of sticks, and he thought, I will tie them in the middle with a piece of string that I can put them on my shoulder and carry them. So another wonderful thing about working with narrow diameter wood is you don't need power tools. Finish the story about the chipper. They used to make lots of brash and chip it. And what they slowly learnt was chipping wood is not a very nice activity, in the sense that those things are really noisy and they're aggressive and kind of snatch the wood out of your hand. And if you were to put an arm in there, you probably wouldn't be very happy about that. Eventually it broke, it parked it in a hedge, they meant to fix it, didn't, year went by, didn't fix it, another year went by, it's all rusted up, ended the chipper. So Chris was then re-confronted with the problem, because it was obviously, wood chips are a very usable resource, but if you sit there making it yourself, it's not so great. It's a byproduct of other kind of semi-industrial processes, to be honest. Anyway, back to the. So he tied his bundle of sticks in the middle with a piece of string and put it on his shoulder to carry it. And because it was only tied in the middle, it all went like that, you know, like different, flopping everywhere. So he realized you need 3 pieces of string, 1 in the middle and 2 obviously split in the distance at a third. And then you've got something which you can carry and you can move around and you can do things with it. He then started to realize that his long bundle of sticks was a useful thing. He could do things with it, like if you lay them along a contour and peg them to the ground, you sort of created a swell-like structure that stops erosion and movement of again, things moving downhill. And he started to play around with it. So here's another little story that Chris likes to tell, and I do like this as well, is the more he started to use these bundles of sticks in landscaping and sort of like experimental creative things he was doing on his land, and I'm going to come to his big discovery in a minute, he started to realize he'd just created something. Because what he realized that you could put piles of them on the ground and then put mud on top of them and put, you know, like subsoil or maybe and build up a structure, and you could sort of start to landscape and change the profile of your land. A bit like perhaps how you might put horsehair into plaster to make it strong. Because if you have sticks and mud, you can start creating something that has some strength to it. So he started reading around to see whether, you know, he really had discovered something. And Chris has this lovely story about when he was a kid, he used to go and visit his granddad, or whatever it was, his great granddad. And he had, you know, the old style, before we had Wikipedia, children, you remember encyclopedias, those books, about 24 volumes that would be the width of a sort of a living room, and had every fact of everything you'd ever known all written down there. And he said whenever he was a kid, go to visit his granddad, he would be lost, he'd be in the attic or whatever, reading through this book, and he fell in love with it, all the old illustrations and the, what have you. So one day, sadly, his granddad passed away, and Chris received the encyclopedia as his, and he still has it in a big chest. He's very proud of it. And he said, I know it's old, so I don't know exactly how old it is, but I know it's old because when you read the chapter on Napoleon, he's not dead yet. So I like that. So it's old. And in it, he found an entry for a bundle of sticks, 2 meters long, tied with 3 pieces of string. And it's called a fascine. And so he hadn't created something, he'd recreated something. Anyway, on we go. So, on Chris's land, he has wetland, and from out of the wetland, there's an issue of water that flows down from left to right of this picture. It's all a bit overgrown at the moment, so you can't quite see it. But what he found was it was very difficult, you can't to get down to this sort of boggy wetland because it's boggy and wet. And, you know, you kind of not going to go up to your knees in some kind of squelchy stuff. And so he thought, wouldn't it be interesting? And so he started throwing bundles of sticks into it. You can see there's this fascine, bundle of sticks, left to right, the stream flowing from left to right. And what he realized was, as he built a level sort of layer of them, obviously more bundles in the middle, he created a causeway where he could now cross the river and cross the wet, muddy bit without going up to his knees in the mud. And then he thought, well, it's all a bit sticky and a bit insecure. So they were excavating the foundations for a building they were building at the time. They had a lot of subsoil, you know, that sort of clay, heavy subsoil, sea horizon soil. And so he started dumping it on top of the sticks. And then they made the horses walk over it. And it all kind of worked into a kind of a thing. It all started to become more solid. And then they put another layer, a bit more mud on top of it. And then he noticed that when the river was in spate and had a rainfall, it didn't stop the river going through, so the river still trickled through it, but it slowed it down. And so when it rained, it would start to well up on the other side on the uphill side of the fascine. And where, if it wasn't level, you could instantly see where it's not level because the water starts to cross it in that point. So you put another bundle of sticks there and a bit more mud. And slowly it starts to build up. And so this is really interesting now. I'm actually starting to raise the water table on the land without just with my leaky dam. So go to the next picture. That's the same place a few years later. And now upstream, this is the fascine. Now it's now living and growing. So we started to put bundles of things into the fascine, including things like willow cuttings, blackcurrant and red cuttings, things from the garden. And of course, those kind of things root and regrow. So he started getting productive growth coming out of his living leaky dam. But also he noticed that upstream, he's now got standing water where he never had it before. And it's starting to fill up with flag iris and bog bean and yellow myrtle and things like that. So get marsh plants turning up. He said one of the horses actually went in there on occasion and it went right up to its sort of fetlock. And he suddenly realized, I got it 6 feet deep the other side. He's raised the water table 6 feet. They had a major flood event, major rain event in Dolgellau a few years ago, quite a few years ago now. And the river went up in one place by 18 foot, the river that these side streams would have drained into. And this was not washed away. It all held it together. And also he saw tons and tons of soil coming off the mountain. The water coming through and over his dam was completely clean because it was being filtered. So then he started to build another one higher up. And this is sort of where some of the thinking then sort of came into what we were doing on the little Nant here at Trevlack that I still haven't seen. Can't wait. But starting to think now, instead of just, we sort of see streams as this straight line of water carving a V notch out of the landscape, chucking that water out as quickly as possible. But what instead, we start to go down the line of think like a beaver. Think like a self-damming river. Think like Victor Schauberger. How can we bring these things together in a way in which we then start to use natural processes to enhance water catchment and retention, water cleaning, creating more habitat for the very plants that clean and oxygenate and revitalize water are those same flag irises and plants that actually, marsh plants grow in marshes by pushing oxygen down into their roots. They still need to form relationships with beneficial bacteria to access nutrients and minerals, but they do that by literally forming a little oxygen envelope around their root tips where those bacteria can exist, and they can also exchange oxygen with the plant. And in the process, they're cleaning and oxygenating the water. In the process, they're pulling dissolved nitrates out of the water, which is the real problem that we have in Wales, anywhere where people are using soluble nitrate fertilizers to create that green-based grasses. Water plus gravity equals eutrophication, equals nitrates in the watercourse. These plants are pulling it out. So we're remediating, we're giving quality back to the water, cleanliness back to the water, extracting nitrogen, oxygenating the water, trapping in the landscape, creating habitat opportunities for other species, building up this the ecological kind of chain and the ecological connections around it. Yields all the way up by utilizing what's within the environment. Chris invited some people from Snowdonia National Park to come to his place and started telling them about what he'd achieved, and he was really getting quite excited. He was talking to them. They're looking at each other like, this guy's a fruitcake. This guy's, it's been a fruitcake. We've got fruitcake. This guy's nuts, and they couldn't kind of quite, I mean, again, it's just a shame that we need to educate the world, right? Okay. Whoops.
So he was collecting the fertility from other places.
Absolutely. And then nitrates in a soluble form are very hazardous. Nitrates in the form of plant matter, very easy to manage. Harvest them, put them on the compost heap, feed them to the horses, whatever. Got them now in a usable form, you can build back into soil again. That can't be the end of the thing. movement. Oh, no, come on, do something. Well, is that it? Is it? Okay, there we go. That's it. Well, we're out of time anyway, so I'll pretend that that's what I meant to happen. Any questions? Any jokes? Any insights? Anyway, thank you for listening. Sorry, I realised I we're out of time, very nearly. Chris has really inspired me. I hope that came across. And it's that constant experimentation and seeing possibilities in things that perhaps other people wouldn't. And understanding that so many of those yields are maybe non-financial or not necessarily productive yields for him himself, but from cleaning water, aerating water, ultimately these are the long-term, deep time yields, to use Hans' wonderful phrase I had this morning. These are things I mean, I'm being a bit jovial, but I actually mean it. When I'm sorry for that, I'm going to get all fired up and get all angry or something. But these are great, insightful ideas. Victor Schauberger, think about observation, how we work, team up and work with nature by using the materials around, but by really understanding the forces that are going on around us. Because everything that he's talking, Chris brought to life there, is addressing many of the issues that we're facing within sort of these depleted landscapes. And the more depleted the landscape gets, the more vulnerable it becomes to things like, you know, catastrophic erosion and contamination of water, groundwater and stuff like that, because all of the layers, the safety net layers, if you like, are being removed as we you know, the more we drill down into it and cause these problems. So all in all, yeah, I hope that kind of feeds the fuel of your ambitions and your imaginations. I'll take any few questions or just points of feedback.
I had a question, Steve.
Yeah.
You know, you're talking to Ian about how pastures could actually like store carbon and sequester it.
Yes.
How does that happen?
Well, simplistically, let's just say there's the roots and the plant, the root, the grasses are growing, and especially if you have more longer term, less intensive forms of grasses, they tend to be more deep rooted. And if you remove the top part of a plant, the plant's actually in proportion. Its canopy and its roots in some way have a relationship. And if we remove the top part, then some of that root matter is shed by the plant because it doesn't sustain its balance. So if we and then because we're not improving our pasture here, we're not ploughing it up and exposing the soil to the air, all that soil carbon is being lost. And if we can keep a permanent sward that's being grazed constantly, it's actually shedding root matter into the soil. And especially if you can build a complex ecology of plants, different root depths, different types of plants, lots of herbs and things like that in the mix as well. And imagine that's been constantly grazed. It's actually returning root matter in the form of carbon into the soil each time that's happening. And because we're not ploughing up, it's actually getting a chance to accumulate. So over long-term periods of time, we can actually stack away a lot of carbon just by constantly grazing, if you like, at pasture.
And also, can I add to that?
Please.
Okay, just also, very true about the root matter going into the soil structure. But it's also true that when you use grazing animals in a managed fashion, you move the animals on a regular basis, rather than cutting it and taking the grass away and then spreading the manure from housed animals. The animals are eating the grass, so if the carbon potential is going through the bodies, being processed, being fermented in the stomachs, coming out. The manure, from a grazing animal, the manure is in a separate place from the urine. And it's only when urine and manure mix, like in slurry tanks or in slow lagoons or in sheds, then that's when ammonia is released. And it can be an even more destructive gas than carbon dioxide when it comes to global warming. So you've got a double benefit of grazing animals in a landscape where they're being moved on a regular basis. And in prehistoric times, that'd be done by predators moving large amounts of animals. The animals would predate, the carnivores would predate the herbivores, and they would keep them in tight clusters. So what they would do, they move on to a patch of grass or a pasture or whatever.
Clearing the forest or
Clearing the
yeah.
forest, they would have a significant impact in a very short space of time. They would trample the grasses and the understory. They eat all the leaves and the browse from the trees. They would crash through, and whether these were cows or whether these elephants, they do the same thing. They have a significant impact for a very short space of time, and then they move on. In prehistoric times by predators, but in these days more likely people like me and Steph with an electric fence to move the cattle on. But they're having a significant impact, but we're moving them on before they actually do any trampling, any damage to the soil structure. So what we're encouraging them to do is take off that regrowth, which comes back very vigorously because the tillering animals actually makes the grass grow more. So they have a significant impact. Take off that the top growth, put it on the ground as manure. They're trampling that the whatever they don't eat into the ground, or the swardy or the feggy sward stuff that they don't like, and then they're moving on. And that stuff is actually sequestered there, and that stuff will regrow using the trampled material as nutrients for the regrowth.
Wait, so I rather suspect he's explained that before. That was very good, very good, very good. Yeah, so, and what he has just given you a thumbnail sketch of is a mob grazing reality, which is exactly that. In a natural world, one of the herbivores would protect themselves by really herding together very tightly. And they'd go there, they'd do exactly that, trample, trash a place, and then they might walk 2 miles before they do it again. So rather than having one cow every 50 meters spread out over a whole landscape, constantly nibbling at it. It's a very different action. But
sorry to interrupt again, but also what happens when you have that set stocking system where you have a set number of animals over a very large space of time, a space of ground, called ranging. So you've got the several fields being grazed at one time. The animals will prefer to graze the fresh new shoots rather than the older feggy stuff. Understandable, right?
Yeah.
They don't want to have the new stuff. Why have the olds and tasteless stuff when they're going to have the fresh new stuff? And it's the same with us. We're going for the fresh salad rather than stuff that's been the chicken soup that's been in the fridge for a week.
Yeah. So we're licking the icing off the top of the bun.
Absolutely, not eating it. But what they do, what that happens is they keep nibbling at the regrowth. And what happens, the grass plant is trying to consistently grow those photosynthesis cells, the PV panels that they need to absorb the sun energy to be able to grow. But because they keep getting nibbled, they have to take energy from somewhere. They can't get from the sun, so they have to take it from the root system. So the root system will eventually just wither and die because these small plants have been exhausted because they've been preferentially grazed by. This is what happens with sheep. One of the things we found when I rented the land out, after my father passed away, we rented the land for 3 years. I reduced the herd of cattle and just kept a couple of fields myself, and the rest of the farm was rented out. What we found was the sheep farmer just set stops. He just opened the gates and just let the sheep have 2 or 3 or 4 fields at a time. What we found after a few years that the thistles went absolutely wild, because what the sheep would do, they'd nibble until the grass plant died, and then there'd be a bare patch of earth, and the most aggressive pioneer species that we have in this part of the world that colonizes bare earth is the thistle. In low or medium nutrient-rich environments, in high nutrient-rich environments, it's usually nettles. Yeah. But with the thistles, and the thistles went absolutely crazy. And I was finding I have to spend a lot of time and energy and diesel power going and topping the fields. And I was trapped in this crazy cycle where the animals were unhealthy because they're on the same piece of ground for an extremely long period of time. The grass was being killed, and so I'd have to reinvest in new grass seed. And so the common intelligence said, or the common methodology said, oh, you've got to plough and you've got to reseed every 3 years. So every 3 years? That's crazy. My dad reseeded half the farm once in 40 years. And I was getting into a system where I was being told that I would have to reseed almost all the farm every 3 years. That's just made no sense at all. So luckily took a step back and looked at a different approach. But yeah.
That's great. There's a full and complete answer, I think you find. Okay, any other just final comments? We have it slightly over time now. Thanks for that question, Alexis. That really, I mean, that's something we really wanted to get to. It's such an important point, and that's so much of what they're trying to do at Trev. Like that difference between kind of just nibbling the whole landscape permanently and exhausting it, or really concentrating the energy of the animals together and driving the ecosystem to have to regenerate itself.
And I do believe that grazing animals can be a force for good in this world. I mean, and it means that we can exhibit our natural behaviours to eat meat as well, which tastes really lovely. Sorry, vegans, but we can use animals to benefit the landscape and actually create diversity. It doesn't have to be a force for ill. And seeing sheep as like maggots on a hillside, yeah, there are problems with overgrazing. I'm not saying there isn't, but there are ways we can manage the landscape effectively with herbivores.
Yeah, absolutely. And only really mimicking what the deer or the other, you know, whatever bison and things that would have moved through this landscape, you know, in a more natural way. They would do exactly, these are the patterning that would have happened.
Being moved on, so
Yeah.
not overgrazing anyone.
Yeah, so it is, they have that impact, but only goes so far. It's not breaking the system down, but they're fully occupying it, if you like, which then triggers the regeneration back. So yeah, good question.
Steve, hopefully a short question. You mentioned about using green manures.
Yes.
On a small scale, sort of like garden scale,
Yeah.
recommend any green manures, or would we be better just still using mulch through the winter time when, you know, there's less crops on the veg patch?
I'm learning about green manures all the time, and the more I get into it, the more I realise how it's a superior method if you can, you know, get it working for you. And there's different kind of strategies. So the first thing is you're growing a plant just that is going to hold the nutrients in the surface of the soil. You let it germinate, it's not going to get very far, and then you're just going to chop it back in again. Now, what happens a lot in the winter, if you can introduce your green manures at just the right time, late summer, or maybe also into September, they'll all start to germinate and they'll start to occupy your soil. And don't forget those plants are putting sugars into the soil and feeding your soil microbes. Then it'll go cold and they'll all just sit there, they'll just stop growing. And so you'll have your ground will be covered and protected going into the through the winter, and then when you're ready to start again, as they start growing again, you dig them in. And what you're trying to holding in mind is you don't want them to set seed, because then you start they start fighting with them. The different ones you can use for different purposes. So a really good one for keeping the soil alive is Phacelia. People use that quite a lot. People use rye as well, actually, and mustard. And there's also those things that will fix nitrogen for you. So you can use this, the clovers. And crimson clover, which is a lovely one to use, but it's quite a tall plant. The bees love it if you actually let it let it seed. It has quite a deeper root system, and we can sometimes use something like crimson clover for breaking up compaction and for sort of regenerating land that's been quite, you know, farmed quite intensively. Something that Emma, I noticed, did quite a lot of was she wouldn't use a mulch on her brassicas because of slugs. And you don't want to create too much slug habitat anywhere near a young brassica plant. But once they're up and they're growing, you then undersow them with white clover. A white clover is a low-growing clover. You often see that in grasses and stuff, and it won't compete with the with the brassicas, because once they're up, obviously they get big and tall. So you can see how you could fill up the spaces between established plants with low-growing things. Now, I would encourage everybody is just to edge your way into it. Go on to somewhere like King Seeds, I think .co.uk or something like that. Get a couple of bags, 2 or 3 different types of green manures, and start playing with them a little bit. And especially once you finish cultivating, or you're coming out of a cultivation cycle. What Yossi and I are doing, we've got sort of ridge and furrow kind of raised beds on our allotments. We tried sowing quite heavily in the furrow with things like clovers and things. We think it doesn't really matter if we stand on them, dig them back in, but yank them up and put them in the compost heap. But yeah, so we're just beginning to experiment. But I would encourage you to too, Dan.
And all tidied away for tomorrow, otherwise I'm not on top of things.
Okay. We're I think we're out of time anyway, so I want to thank everybody for their attention. I hope you've had a interesting and informative day, and lovely to see all your faces. I'd like to see you all for real. Yeah, enjoy. Check out Victor Schauberger, look in the resources on the website, and have fun, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Let's
Thanks,
start.